July of 2019. The Pittsburgh sky was thick with dust from the dying Keystone Ironworks. For weeks, the familiar silhouette of the plant had been shrinking under the systematic assault of demolition crews. On the 12th, they began work on Cooling Tower Number 4, a concrete monolith that had stood silent for over 2 decades. The hydraulic shears, designed to tear through reinforced concrete, bit into the tower's base. Then, a shriek of metal on metal. The operator stopped, thinking he'd hit a forgotten support beam. A foreman peered into the breach and saw not rebar, but the clean industrial weld of a sealed maintenance hatch, where no hatch was marked on any modern blueprint. An hour later, with the plate cut away, the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness and fell upon human bones, a rusted horseshoe resting near the skeleton's hand. At that moment, the case of the disappearance of Ethan McKay, who vanished 25 years ago, was reopened. March 12, 1994. The day began for Ethan McKay like any other. It was a Tuesday, cold and grey, with the air tasting of coal dust and the damp earth of a lingering Pittsburgh winter. Before leaving, his daughter had pressed a small, rusted horseshoe into his palm, a souvenir from a school trip. She called it his good luck charm, and he promised to keep it with him always. He smiled, tucked it into his worn leather satchel, and went to work. He was an industrial mechanic, one of the best. A freelancer trusted with the aging, temperamental machinery that was the city's lifeblood. That afternoon, the call came from Keystone Ironworks, an emergency repair on a critical pressure valve. It was a routine job for a man of his skill. He arrived, did the work with his usual quiet competence, and by late afternoon, the valve was holding steady. He was a man who lived by routine, by the predictable rhythm of machinery and home life. At 5:05 in the evening, he used a workshop phone to call his wife. The conversation was brief, normal. He was packing up his tools. He would be home in time for dinner. She could hear the clang of metal in the background as he spoke. He said, "I love you," and hung up. His truck remained in the visitor's parking lot. His toolkit, neatly locked inside, was on the passenger seat. At his home, dinner grew cold on the table. The minutes stretched into an hour, the hour into a night of frantic, unanswered calls. The silence that fell after that 5:05 p.m. phone call would last for 25 years. Contact was lost, complete and final. Back in the present, the demolition site became a crime scene. Detective Deborah Stanley of the Pittsburgh PD's Cold Case Unit stood before the breach in the concrete, the stale air of the tomb mixing with the dust of the demolition. The space was not a place one could fall into by accident. It was a sarcophagus, intentionally designed and sealed. The forensic team worked under portable floodlights, their movements precise and methodical in the cramped space. The skeleton of Ethan McKay lay on its back, a posture of placement, not of a fall. The remnants of his work coveralls were almost fused with the concrete floor by decades of moisture and decay. Every piece of evidence was photographed, logged, and bagged. The rusted horseshoe, fragments of a leather satchel, its contents long since turned to dust, the bones themselves. The first key questions began to form, sharp and insistent in Stanley's mind. The hatch hadn't been bolted, it had been welded shut from the outside. The metallurgical report would later confirm the welds were consistent with factory equipment used at Keystone in the mid-1990s. This required access, skill, and heavy equipment. Who had that? Why was the crawl space itself forgotten? It didn't appear on any of the updated schematics used by the demolition crew. Someone had to know this specific, obscure pocket of the plant existed. Someone had to know it was the perfect place to hide a body forever. And then there was the final, haunting detail. The autopsy would later reveal no signs of struggle, no broken bones from a fight or a fall. It was a clean disposal. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was not a heated argument that ended in tragedy. The evidence pointed to a calculated operation, a cold and efficient disposal of a human being, as if he were nothing more than industrial waste. The scale of the cover-up was becoming clear. This was an execution, followed by an entombment. The 1994 investigation began with textbook procedure. Detectives canvassed Keystone Iron Works, interviewing workers who were on shift that day. They spoke of McKay as a quiet, focused man who kept to himself. No one saw anything unusual. They noted his truck in the lot, untouched. His wife's tearful testimony painted a picture of a devoted husband and father with no known enemies and no reason to disappear. The investigation had a victim and a location, but no crime scene. The official narrative was shaped in the pristine office of the plant manager, a young and ambitious Lawrence Cahill. He was cooperative, expressing deep concern for the missing contractor. He provided employee records and access logs, but subtly steered the police narrative. He spoke of the pressures of freelance work, hinted at financial difficulties McKay might have been facing, and planted the seed of a man who might have simply walked away from it all. His security chief, Marcus Thorne, corroborated everything, presenting a united and unbreachable front. The physical evidence, or lack thereof, cemented this theory. The low-quality VHS security tapes from the front gate were reviewed. They showed McKay walking towards the exit, but the footage became grainy and indistinct before he reached it. A convenient power fluctuation, Thorne explained, had caused a recording gap of several minutes. The crucial period was a blank. With no signs of foul play in the parking lot and no other witnesses, the police had nothing to contradict the official story. The investigation pivoted from a potential homicide to a standard missing persons case. Rumors circulated, fed by carefully placed whispers. McKay had a gambling problem. McKay was in debt. McKay had a secret life. The police, facing pressure to close cases and presented with the convenient explanation of a man abandoning his family, accepted it. It was a simpler, cleaner conclusion than a murder on the property of one of Pittsburgh's most powerful families. Within a year, the case of Ethan McKay was officially declared cold. The silence that descended was not just the absence of answers. It was a carefully constructed wall, built with the influence of corporate power and reinforced by the willingness of law enforcement to look the other way. The decision to stop looking was not just negligence. It was a form of complicity that allowed a man to remain entombed in concrete for a quarter of a century. With the physical evidence from the tower secured, Detective Stanley's investigation turned to the ghosts of Keystone Iron Works. She began tracking down former employees, men and women now in their 60s and 70s, scattered across the Rust Belt. Their memories were faded, coated with a quarter century of life and deliberate forgetting. They remembered the plant's closure, the loss of their jobs, but the specific details of a single day in March of 1994 were lost in a haze. They remembered Ethan McKay only as a name from a long-ago police interview. A freelancer, an outsider. Most recalled the security chief, Marcus Thorne, as a company man, loyal to a fault. When Stanley mentioned Lawrence Cahill, however, the tone shifted. The vague nostalgia hardened into a cautious respect, tinged with fear. He was the boss's son, one former foreman said, his gaze distant. A man who got what he wanted. You learned early on not to get in his way. No one had a specific accusation, only a shared, instinctual understanding of the plant's hierarchy of power. Human memory proved to be a dead end. So, Stanley turned to paper. After weeks of legal wrangling, her team gained access to the Keystone corporate archives, now stored in the climate-controlled basement of Cahill's downtown real estate firm. They were confronted with a mountain of documentation, thousands of dusty boxes filled with invoices, personnel files, and maintenance logs. It was a painstaking, tedious process of reconstructing the factory's life beat by beat. The initial search confirmed what they already knew. Personnel files showed Marcus Thorne was the head of security on the day of McKay's disappearance. Maintenance logs confirmed McKay had been signed in to perform an emergency repair on pressure valve 7C. But beneath the mundane, Stanley was looking for the anomaly, the single entry that broke the pattern of a normal workday. Days of sifting through faded carbon copies and dot matrix printouts yielded nothing. Then, a junior detective, cross-referencing supply orders with work schedules, found it. It wasn't a smoking gun, just a small, puzzling inconsistency. It was a purchase order dated March 13, 1994, the day after Ethan McKay vanished. The order was for 2 industrial-sized canisters of argon gas and a box of high-tensile welding rods delivered to the maintenance department. According to the plant's own quarterly reports, all major welding projects for that sector had been completed 2 weeks prior. There was no scheduled work, no repair order, no official justification for the purchase. It was a tool without a job, an expense without a reason. The discovery of the welding equipment invoice, dated the day after McKay's disappearance, created a logical paradox. If McKay was killed and sealed in the tower on March 12th, why was the equipment for sealing it purchased on March 13th? The timeline didn't fit. For a methodical investigator like Deborah Stanley, a paradox suggested a flawed premise. She and her team began to entertain a new, compelling theory. The murder and the concealment were 2 separate events, separated by 25 years. The investigation pivoted away from the ghosts of 1994 and focused on the present-day demolition crew. The logic was simple and brutal. Perhaps a worker cutting into the tower had stumbled upon McKay's remains accidentally. This worker, maybe on parole or with an immigration status to protect, panicked. Instead of reporting the discovery and inviting police scrutiny into their life, they made a desperate decision to hide the body again, welding the hatch shut and hoping the demolition would pulverize the evidence forever. For weeks, this theory consumed the investigation. Stanley's team interrogated every member of the demolition crew, poring over their work histories and criminal records. They analyzed the modern cutting and welding tools used on site, comparing them to the marks on the sealed hatch. The focus was intense, the pressure mounting on the foreman and his crew, who found their lives dissected under the harsh glare of a homicide investigation. It was a plausible scenario, a story of modern desperation layered on top of an old tragedy. But the theory began to fray. The workers' alibis were solid. None had a record that suggested a propensity for such a high-stakes cover-up. The wear patterns on their modern equipment didn't perfectly match the decades-old breach. The investigation was chasing shadows, burning valuable time and resources, while the true trail grew even colder. The convincing theory was leading nowhere. The final collapse came not from an interrogation room, but from the quiet, sterile environment of the forensics lab. The metallurgical report on the welds from the sealed hatch was complete. The conclusion was irrefutable. The composition of the welding rods and the decay of the argon-fused metal were consistent with materials and techniques used at Keystone Iron Works in the mid-1990s. The welds were 25 years old. The tomb had been sealed the first time. The murder and the burial were a single, seamless event. Stanley realized they had been looking at the puzzle upside down. The investigation was adrift, bogged down by a collapsed theory and 25 years of cold silence. Then the phone rang. The call came to the cold case unit's tip line. The voice on the other end was a woman's, thin and trembling with a weight she had carried for years. She refused to give her name, but she identified herself as the daughter of Marcus Thorne, the former security chief of Keystone Iron Works, who had died of a heart attack in 2015. She spoke in hushed, fragmented sentences about a deathbed confession. Her father, delirious with pain and fear, had whispered about the man in the tower and a sin he could not take to his grave. He said that Mr. Cahill made me do it. Before he died, he told her to check the factory blueprints in his old lockbox, but she had been too afraid, until now. Armed with this testimony, Detective Stanley obtained a warrant. The lockbox was in the daughter's attic, a small metal container holding the ghosts of a dead man's career. Inside, beneath old service medals and union papers, was a rolled-up set of 1990s-era Keystone Ironworks blueprints. Stanley carefully unrolled the brittle paper on a table. On the schematic for cooling tower number 4, a section was circled in red ink. The circle enclosed the long-forgotten maintenance crawl space. Beside it, in small, cramped handwriting, was a note. His luck ran out. 3/12/94. Suddenly, every disparate piece of the puzzle snapped into place. The horseshoe, his daughter's good luck charm, was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a symbol of the crime's cruel irony. The anonymous daughter's testimony provided the final, critical element: the motive. Her father had confessed not just to helping hide a body, but to helping cover up why he was killed. Ethan McKay, the meticulous mechanic, hadn't just fixed a pressure valve. He had stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see: a secret, illegal discharge pipe used by Lawrence Cahill to dump thousands of gallons of toxic chemical waste into the Ohio River, saving the company millions. He had confronted Cahill, and for that, he was silenced. The welding equipment, ordered the day after his disappearance, now made perfect sense. The murder happened on the night of the 12th. The body was moved. Then, on the 13th, Thorne, the loyal accomplice, performed the final act, welding the hatch shut and creating a clean paper trail for the supplies he used to do it. The scattered details had coalesced into a single, terrifying picture of corporate greed and calculated murder. Based on the evidence gathered and the confession of Marcus Thorne's daughter, the final hours of Ethan McKay's life can now be reconstructed with chilling clarity. After completing his work on the pressure valve, McKay, a man of meticulous habit, must have noticed an anomaly, a pipe that shouldn't be there, leading away from the main system. He followed it. What he found was the company's darkest secret: a bypass channel designed to dump thousands of gallons of toxic chemical waste directly into the Ohio River. An honest man, McKay saw this not as an opportunity, but as a violation that had to be reported. He went to the office of the plant manager, Lawrence Cahill. The confrontation would have begun professionally, with McKay presenting what he had found, perhaps believing it was an oversight. But Cahill's reaction, a cold, dismissive denial, would have confirmed McKay's suspicions. He had uncovered not a mistake, but a deliberate multi-million-dollar crime. He told Cahill he had to report it. That was his death sentence. Cahill, seeing his ambition and family legacy threatened, knew McKay could not be allowed to leave the factory grounds. Under the pretext of inspecting the pipe together, he lured McKay to a more secluded area of the plant, away from the shift-change crowds. In the shadow of a silent blast furnace, the conversation ended abruptly. The next sound was not of machinery, but the dull, heavy impact of dense metal striking a human skull. Ethan McKay fell without a sound, his world extinguished in an instant. His leather satchel dropped beside him, the good luck horseshoe he promised his daughter he'd keep safe spilling onto the grimy concrete floor. The silence that followed was absolute. Cahill made one phone call. Marcus Thorne, the security chief bound by a debt of loyalty, arrived minutes later. There was no panic, only methodical precision. Thorne became a ghost in the machine, erasing the security logs for the back of the plant and procuring a utility cart. Under the cover of darkness and the noise of the departing shift, they moved McKay's body to the base of the decommissioned cooling tower number 4, a place no one had a reason to inspect. They placed him inside the forgotten crawl space. The horseshoe was left near his hand, an object of love and luck, becoming the final, silent witness to a brutal murder. The next day, Thorne, using the newly ordered welding equipment, sealed the maintenance hatch shut. The bright, searing arc of the welder's torch cut through the darkness, and with each pass, the hum of the machine wrote the final sentence of Ethan McKay's life and the first line of a 25-year secret. Armed with the blueprint and the sworn testimony of Marcus Thorne's daughter, Detective Stanley confronted Lawrence Cahill. The final damning piece of evidence came from the forensics lab. A re-examination of the tattered remnants of McKay's boots found microscopic traces of the specific chemical waste from the illegal dumping. The chain of evidence was complete and unbreakable. Days later, as Lawrence Cahill stood at a podium before a crowd of journalists to announce his latest downtown development project, two uniformed officers stepped forward. The arrest was quiet, efficient, and broadcast live. The image of the celebrated philanthropist in handcuffs becoming the final, ignominious chapter of the Keystone Ironworks story. The trial was a media sensation. Cahill's high-priced legal team attempted to discredit Thorne's deathbed confession and portray his daughter as a liar. But they could not argue with the physical evidence. The blueprint with its hand-drawn circle, the anomalous purchase order for welding equipment, and the chemical residue on McKay's boots formed a narrative that was irrefutable. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The verdict was guilty of first-degree murder. Lawrence Cahill was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ethan McKay's daughter sat in the front row for every day of the trial. She never wept, never spoke to the press. When the verdict was read, she simply closed her eyes, a silent, deeply personal acknowledgement of a truth she had waited 25 years to hear confirmed. For the city of Pittsburgh, the verdict was a shock, a story of a titan's fall from grace. For her, it was simply the end of a long, unanswered question. The gavel fell and legal justice was served. But no verdict can return a stolen father or erase a quarter-century of grief built on a foundation of lies. The conviction of Lawrence Cahill closed a police file, a final entry in a long dormant ledger. It provided a conclusion, but it could not provide a cure for the wounds inflicted by an act of calculated greed so many years ago. The demolition of Keystone Ironworks was completed in the months following the trial. The blast furnaces and cooling towers, monuments to a bygone era of industry, were reduced to rubble and hauled away. Where the factory once choked the sky with smoke, there is now open air. The land itself, once saturated with chemicals and secrets, was eventually reclaimed. Today, it is a public park. Children run on green lawns where molten steel once flowed. Near the entrance, almost hidden from view, is a small, unassuming bronze plaque. It was placed there at the insistence of the McKay family. Its inscription reads, "In memory of Ethan McKay, a good man who stood up for what was right." It is a quiet testament to a quiet man whose integrity proved more enduring than concrete and steel. The horseshoe, after being logged as evidence and presented to the jury, was returned to Ethan's daughter. It was the only physical object of her father's she had left from that final day. A simple, rusted piece of metal, a promise kept that ultimately unraveled an empire built on a foundation of murder. Lawrence Cahill will spend the remainder of his life in a concrete cell, a different kind of tomb from the one he built for his victim. His philanthropy is now a footnote to his crime. He built an empire on the lie that an ordinary man's life was a disposable commodity, and discovered decades too late that the truth has its own patient timetable for justice. And today, where cooling tower number 4 once stood, there is a smooth lawn, perfectly smooth, as if nothing had ever been beneath it. But the silence here is different. It no longer conceals a crime. It holds a memory.